Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Joey Cochran. I am the social media coordinator for the Conference on Faith and History. We welcome you today to our panel on the history of gun violence in the United States. Before we begin the panel, I'd like to give you a few brief announcements on behalf of the Conference on Faith and History. First, we will be having a book talk on Thursday, October 12th at 12 p.m. Central Time with Mark Edwards, author of Walter Lippmann, American Skeptic and American Pastor. So we invite you to come to that live event as well. And as with all of our other book talks and panels, you'll be able to listen to it as a podcast afterwards. If you are a member of the Conference on Faith and History and you are interested in submitting a journal article or writing a book review, you may do so by contacting our editor, Alicia Kaufman, at fetus@baylor.edu, or our book review editor, david.comline at westernsim.edu is the best way to get a hold of our book review editor, David Comline. And then also, as we've moved into a semester of school, I just want to continue to encourage people to talk to your students, talk to your department, talk to your colleagues about joining the Conference on Faith and History, encourage them to visit our website, find out more about the regular events that we do here, and find ways to get plugged in and networked with us. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Ray Chang, who will be moderating our event.
Well, it's great to be with you all. My name is Ray Chang. As Joey just mentioned, I am so thrilled to be in this conversation with such brilliant minds and compassionate hearts. I'm actually here at the White House at the moment, and so in the Secretary of War's office suite, talking about protecting houses of worship, and of course, the large part of that is the impact of guns and the easy access that people have to guns. So I don't know if I'm going to get kicked out of this room because some of the White House staff were looking for a conference room that they can book for me, but they said, hey, these might be open, but I think that there's a pecking order here, and I'm probably not at the top of the pecking order. Just down the hall is the Vice President's office, and then several other secretaries in the White House. And so I'll give you a little show. This is what it looks like. Very empty. There's a little suite over there, and then it's like a really historic looking building. And so really great to be together. This is such an important conversation, and I think framing it in the context of faith and history is essential, because you don't know how we got here unless you look at the history of activity and events that brought us to this moment. And then, of course, as Christians, we're always committed to how faith integrates into our entire being and how it impacts the ways that we navigate the world. Just a few things that would be helpful to know. At the current moment, there are more guns in the United States than there are people. And according to statistics, that where there are more guns, there tends to be more gun violence. Not surprising. Guns are the leading cause of death among youth, and then of course part of that is also accidental death, and then death by suicide, which does increase significantly through guns. There is a significant less sense of hopelessness that many feel around this issue, but that's not necessarily doesn't have to be the case, because we can call for common sense safety laws as we live in a democratic republic, and our votes can contribute our voices to the matter. We can also do things like ask people to turn their guns into garden tools, and then, of course, do other things like call for kind of a compassionate approach to gun buyback. One of the things I've engaged with this issue through the Asian American Christian Collaborative, which I serve as the president of, is how actively gun manufacturers are seeking to sell guns. Not surprising at all. Their goal is to primarily sell more guns. And one of the ways that they're doing that is by actively marketing, connecting with, and engaging with racialized minority communities. And so their new target market is racialized minority populations, because they've oversaturated the white population when it comes to guns. I'm joined by some incredible guests and friends who all wrote stunning pieces for a collaboration with the Anxious Bench and the Asian American Christian Collaborative. Many of you who are a part of this conversation will likely know them, but just in case you don't, I'll go down and introduce each of them, all of whom are incredible scholars and people of faith. Dr. Melissa Borja is the assistant professor of American culture and Asian Pacific Islander American Studies at the University of Michigan. She is Harvard trained, also trained from the University of Chicago and at Columbia. So lots of brain power there. She's a historian of migration, religion, race, and politics, and the author of Follow the New Way, American Refugee Resettlement Policy and Hmong Religious Change. She's advised Princeton's Religion and Forced Migration Initiative and is the lead investigator of the Virulent Hate Project and has contributed research to stop API hate. Dr. Ansley Quiros is associate professor, not pastor, associate professor of history and department chair at the University of North Alabama in Florence, Alabama. She's from Atlanta. She studies the 20th century United States with the focus on race, politics, and religion. Her first book, God With Us, Lived Theology and the Black Freedom Struggle in America, argued that the civil rights struggle was also a theological one in Southwest Georgia. And while her current project is a biography of activists Charles and Shirley Sherrod. And then we have none other than Reverend Dr. Malcolm Foley, who serves as special advisor to the president of Baylor University for Equity and Campus Engagement, as well as the director of Black Church Studies at Truett Theological Seminary. He holds a PhD in religion from Baylor University and is currently writing a book tentatively titled The Children of Mammon, arguing that the only truly anti-racist Christian communities are the ones that resist greed and economic exploitation. He also, because he's not doing enough, serves as the pastor at Waco, or at Mosaic Waco, which is an intentionally multicultural, non-denominational church in Waco, Texas. Joey Cochran is a neighbor of mine in the Chicagoland area, who is also serving as a visiting assistant professor at Wheaton College in history. He's a social media coordinator for the Conference on Faith and History, and then, of course, the general editor at the Anxious Bench. So he's also doing very little with his time. So grateful to be together, all of you. Thanks for spending time and allowing me to facilitate this conversation. We're really glad for this collaboration between the Faith and History Conference, as well as with the Asian American Christian Collaborative. I'm going to start with you, Melissa, if that's okay. And then, of course, anyone else can chime in. But let's start a little bit personal. What's your personal connection, scholarship, or lived experience, or both, to the issue of gun violence? I mean, all four of you wrote on this issue, and it was an automatic yes. It was so easy for you to say, "I want to write on this." Why is this an issue? Why is this issue an important one for you, for scholars, people of faith, and community members to address?
Yes, I think for many of us, our work in the community and our work as scholars is rooted in our personal experiences and our backgrounds. And that's certainly true for me in relation to the issue of gun violence. So a little bit about me. I was born and raised in rural Michigan. I grew up in a house full of guns, which is very weird to explain to some of my friends on the East Coast. Unlocked guns, loaded guns, just guns everywhere in my house. I come from a family of a lot of people in the military. My family are avid riflery enthusiasts. So like that is our background. And yet I live in a community, I live in downtown Indianapolis, that has been ravaged by gun violence. We have had such spectacular amounts of gun violence due to big events like the FedEx shooting in 2021 to daily horrors. I'm married to a surgeon who on occasion will be on call and will have multiple gunshot wound victims to attend to throughout the night. He had trained in New York City, never had as many gun violence victims to care for as he has had in Indianapolis. We've had shootings take place at the place where my daughter waited for her bus to school, on 2 blocks south of where I live, on the route that she currently walks to her high school. It is everywhere. And I will say that my commitment to addressing the issue of gun violence is really fundamentally about my commitment to caring for my neighbor, literally the people around me in downtown Indianapolis who are dying of gun violence all the time.
Thanks for sharing. Would any of you and would any of the others like to share why they're so passionate or believe that this is an important matter?
I think for me, one of the aspects that's amplified and escalated my interest on this topic is the everyday, day-to-day moments of dropping my children off at school and hearing them actually talk about this issue and wrestle with anxieties of the fact that they might be a victim of a mass shooting, and how much it dominates their mind in a way that it never occurred to me as an elementary, middle school, high school age student in the 80s and 90s.
Those are real moments.
For me, particularly as a historian of racial violence, and also as somebody who's named after Malcolm X, the question particularly, and also as a Christian who commits to a book of scriptures which are fundamentally anti-empire, and when we look at particularly the fact that one of the greatest tools of empire is violence, these conversations have been at the front of my mind, especially over the course of the past year or two. But one of the ways that that's manifested itself is in me developing a deeper commitment to nonviolence, which then requires a lot of creativity in a nation with such a robust gun culture. And so for me, this is part of a continuing journey for me in thinking through, okay, what does obedience to Christ look like? Because I deeply believe that Christ has called us to that kind of life too. And so I think about that as a pastor. I think about that in my work at Baylor, but also in my writing as well. So all of that, that's the soup from which this emerges for me.
I'll just add quickly that, like Malcolm, I was interested in this question because I'm so taken with nonviolence in the context of Black activists. And I wouldn't have said I had much of a personal connection necessarily, aside from just general fear and anxiety in schools. But then as I was drafting the piece, the Covenant school shooting happened, and I had worked at Covenant when I was a grad student. And so that it just was a powerful reminder that these things that are affecting, as Melissa said so beautifully, our neighbors, they're personal to us, especially as believers, that when one part of the body is afraid and terrorized by violence, then we all are.
Thanks all for sharing everything that you just did. I mean, I think so many people will resonate with what you shared. And out of that soup, hopefully we'll be able to make a better stew and a full meal. I mean, all of you wrote incredible pieces for on this issue for the Anxious Bench. Everyone should, if you're listening in, take a moment to Google the writings that everyone kind of produced. I'm sure that this will probably be in the show notes as well. And if it's not, you can just you can go through the Anxious Bench website and then check out each of the authors. But you know, Ansley, we're all Christian, and one of the things that that you brought up was that it was you cited and borrowed from Gary Willis's notion of America's gun culture as Moloch. Why did you do that? And can you kind of frame it so that we're starting a little bit more theologically on this issue?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for that question. As I was thinking through this, that was the only language I could find sufficient for the evil that we're up against. And so I find that talking about gun violence as a political issue normalizes it in a way. It sort of like creates an even playing field. And I don't think that what we're dealing with, honestly, is a political issue. And so Gary Wills's piece, which was written, I mean, this is sort of depressing, but it was written in 2012. So over 10 years ago, he wrote about gun violence. He wrote about the NRA, and he talked about it as making this comparison to Moloch, who of course is this pagan god of child sacrifice, of human sacrifice, and equating our worship in this country of guns, which is, and Malcolm will talk about this, which is also a worship of money, and an exchange for human life. And so that instead of worshiping God, worshiping the Christian God, God of mercy, a God of steadfast love, a God of sacrifice himself, that worshiping this tool of violence. And so I found this very powerful. If you're thinking about, remember when congressmen and women and senators used to wear cross lapel pins, and now they're wearing these AK-47 lapel pins? Like that's a symbol of worship. And so I found that the language of religion, the language of religious studies is really what's at stake. We are sacrificing children. We are sacrificing human beings created in God's image to something. And what is that something? And so I think that language is what a lot of people feel in their souls. And so when we talk about, we can have a conversation about rights, we can have a conversation about the Second Amendment, but that normalizes the evil in a way that I think Christians should oppose. And I think we have that language to offer to the conversation. So I was really grateful for Gary Wills's old piece and horrified by its continuing resonance.
That's so good. And yeah, and assault on anyone who bears the image of God through assault weapons, I think needs to be addressed. But that does lead us to the sense that, and when I share the statistics, or when people hear statistics like there are more guns than people in the United States, and this kind of unnuanced understanding of the origins of the Second Amendment, which Joey goes into, as well as how it's interpreted today and utilized today, oftentimes leads to a sense of hopelessness. But then, Malcolm, you provocatively claim that relying on guns and violence more broadly is a refusal of hope, which is a distinctly Christian exercise. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, great question, right? So I told Ansley in the chat that this is like a pagan god face off between Moloch and Mammon, my favorite god to fight against, specifically because I mean the fact that Christ tells us that the two masters that we're often choosing between are God and Mammon. I take that to heart. And you even noted this earlier, Ray, that that gun manufacturers want to sell guns, and to do so, especially now, they're focusing on communities of color, and that makes good business sense, because those who are being targeted, those who are being targeted not only by we'll say a violent empire, but also just by crazy people, they're going to seek to defend themselves, and especially for Black people in this country, resistance to oppression has always required creativity. And the point that I make in this claim, to say that relying on guns and violence is a refusal of hope. To respond to violence with violence is the least creative response to violence. It bears witness to, and it is also a, this comes back to, I think, one of these fundamental ethical commands that we get from the scriptures. When we repay evil with evil, what we're also doing is snuffing out someone else's opportunity for repentance. And that is a framing, that's a framing of this issue that a lot of people like antennas go up, because the first thing that goes through our minds, and this is something I had to wrestle with as I wrestle with my namesake, when Malcolm X talked about specifically self-defense, it's so reasonable to say, somebody comes at you, you put them in the ground. Like, that's just that sounds right. It sounds right to us. But what that also, but I think one of the things that also suggests is you have already, in a sense, submitted yourself to the irredeemability of the person who has attacked you. And that is in itself a refusal of the Christian hope. All of this is very difficult. Like, all this is very difficult even for me to say, but I really have come to deeply believe that this is actually the case, that actually what Christ is calling us to is bearing witness to a reality that we cannot see right now, and yet one is exemplified by the cross. And so I think, one of actually the most profound messages of the cross is that a reliance on violence is actually a denial of hope.
That's so good. Yeah, you cannot worship God if you are worshiping Moloch or Mammon, which is the position that it feels like we're in and articulating. And to be a Christian is to not just have this ethereal sense of hope, but a embodied sense of hope, which is an act of resistance against acting on violence with violence, which is so great. Because I don't know if you recently heard one of the Republican presidential candidates, I think it was the former vice president, in a comment said that the way to address gun violence, mass shootings, is by instilling the death penalty rapidly, which seems very contrary to what you just said, Malcolm. And I hope that Christians who listen in would take into consideration your beautifully articulated theological argument. Now, Joey, we have a good kind of basis for a theological kind of move towards talking about gun violence, but we don't live in a society that is void of laws and histories of those laws being written and policies. You claim that Second Amendment rights have been about protecting white supremacy. How does that come to be? Would you describe some of the ways that colonizers employed firearms to establish their supremacy over lands of Maya, Aztec, and woodland natives as a part of that thesis and historical kind of reality? And how are you thinking through this?
Just to begin, we have to think about what first encounters were like in the Americas. And in all of the first encounters that I read, you see this distinct display of white power, and it's recorded by the inhabitants, and it comes from their perspective. When messengers from Moctezuma first saw the Spanish and climbed aboard their ship, the first thing that they did was they offered gifts to Hernan Cortez and to his sailors. The first thing that Hernan Cortez did was he clasped them in irons and he shot off his cannon to demonstrate his domination and his power. And in their observations about this event, the first remarks describe who these people are, and they're described as light-skinned, white people. They look like the inside of a lime. And so there's this connection of whiteness and how whiteness is demonstrated through domination, through power, and through the symbol of a firearm. When you get to the Dutch and the French, who are occupying French Canadian territory, they're going to then turn around and they're going to use their firearms, their weapons, to help decimate the natives. And they're going to actually arm the natives to decimate one another. In the fur trade, the Huron are collecting all of the beaver pelts on behalf of the French. And what the Dutch are going to do is they have more accurate, better 17th century firearms. They're going to equip the Iroquois natives to simply kill the Huron and take the pelts from them and encourage them to use violence with weapons to decimate one another and to have Indian on Indian killings, which is not very different from the way we see black on black killings and how white people treat them today. So embedded within the origins and the history of white encounters with native peoples or peoples of color, you have this either domination of power or this employment of the weapons so that they would be eliminated and removed from their lands.
It's very thorough and very helpful. I don't know if most people would even know that. But, you know, the other thing you kind of highlight in your article is about some of the policies that existed to keep First Nations, natives, and slaves or African slaves, chattel slaves, disposed of firearms. How did British colonizers employ the militia and firearms to control the lives of plantation slaves in, for example, Chesapeake?
Yeah, so just to start with the law policies, it's very interesting that the British incurred different laws and policies than either the French or the Dutch. The Dutch eventually follow suit with the British as they realize what they've done with equipping and putting guns and powder and shot in the hands of natives. But from the get-go, throughout the British colonies, there are numerous laws that are enacted that are intentionally designed to prevent natives from having firearms and from slaves from having firearms. And then later on in the 17th century, when it's become determined that it might be actually advantageous to be able to control slaves, they do start in Chesapeake handing guns to natives in exchange for a captive Negro being returned to the plantation. In this world, the militia is organized, it's orderly used, mostly to patrol, to control roads, to see if there are slaves that have escaped from their plantations. The militia is used to dominate and to seize any weapons, any possessions inside slave quarters, to randomly search all slave quarters to dispossess them of any special goods, especially potential weapons that they might use to revolt or poisons that they might use to harm the white plantation owners. So throughout the early laws of Chesapeake, New England, and in the Dutch colonies as well, it's going to develop specific laws that say you cannot give guns to Indians, you cannot give guns to Negroes, and if you repair guns that they have, if you arm them, if you provide them any of the tools that they need to fire a firearm, then we are going to fine you at least 40 shillings, sometimes 5 pounds, sometimes 10 pounds for that action.
That's so helpful, because I don't think most people, the average American or the average Christian in the US, would know that the origins of the Second Amendment really emerged in order to provide legal means for the militia to essentially round up those who are enslaved to be, from leaving, or to take land from those who would be here in First Nations populations. And so I think it's worth kind of reflecting on to examine the origins of that. But Ansley, like as we track through history, we're not just talking about, the 1700s. We're also talking about things like the civil rights movement, which is synonymous with nonviolent direct action, oftentimes conjuring images of students sitting in at lunch counters while being beaten, standing still while facing attack dogs and water hoses. And while all that's certainly true, your piece also invites a more complicated reckoning with the role of violence in the civil rights movement. Can you explain a little bit about that and the impact of guns there?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And I'll try to connect it with Joey's great history as well, which is that we sometimes think, white people, I should say, sometimes think that it is that people of color, that in Joey's case, Indians and Black Americans in the colonies are just naturally nonviolent. And that's not true. And so throughout, I think what's really helpful in that deep history lesson is that people are people, and they are absolutely trying to exercise resistance to the oppression that they're facing. So there are lots of slave rebellions. There are lots of rebellions in which indigenous people and Black enslaved people link up and like have massive battles. Like there is a violent resistance to oppression that people are engaged in. And so these gun laws and these fines for helping people of color obtain access to firearms are in response to resistance from those people and a desire to subjugate them. Where that comes across in the civil rights movement is that we still kind of have a mythology of Black people as being like inherently saintly, maybe in that movement. These kids who are sitting in, who have these beautiful hearts for justice. And we kind of think of this in the dreamy 60s. Think of Martin Luther King. We've so sanctified him and not really grappled with his personhood. We've so mythologized him and some other leaders of the movement that we've lost the decisiveness, the clarity, moral clarity with which they exercise the decision to pursue nonviolence. And even and so I guess what I was trying to show in the piece is that violence has always been an option for Black Americans resisting oppression. And it's an option in the civil rights movement. So there's certainly practical reasons why nonviolence would be a choice. So use of the media, as you have in national media, nonviolence can be helpful in provoking a Bull Connor or something. But those are not the reasons that most of the activists give. They give moral reasons. Those sorts of reasons that Malcolm was talking about earlier about hope, what my friend Anthony Siracusa calls decisions about how to be in the world. These are folks who have grappled and wrestled with questions of violence. Often they're coming from reservoirs of deep faith, and they're making these decisions very consciously. So King, who is always like our mythologized symbol of nonviolence, actually has a gun at one point, and Bayard Rustin, the great activist, sees it and asks King about it. And King invokes this desire for self-defense. He has a young family at the time. He's living in Birmingham, Alabama. People know who he is. He's facing a lot of threats. And Bayard Rustin talks to him about nonviolence, about the possibilities of nonviolence, about the need to hold this movement as a moral movement. And King is convinced, partly by Rustin, partly by James Lawson, partly by a visit to Gandhi in India. He's convinced that his thinking on violence is part of this larger movement. But it's not the only option. Malcolm X, of course, is one option, but you also have people like Robert Williams, who I pointed out in the piece, who's a Southerner, who absolutely uses violence to defend himself and his community. And so the decision for nonviolence is a decision to embody the beloved community. Not just request it, not just demand it, not hold America hostage to get it. Although sometimes, we want to do that, but to embody that community and offer repentance, as Malcolm mentioned, and to hopefully convert people's hearts. That's a harder thing to do. And I think it's a different sort of kingdom. So they chose to trust in a different sort of logic, a different sort of kingdom. And a lot of them got hurt doing that. And yet it was, I think, a beautiful and true way to pursue change and to pursue racial justice.
So we're now talking about a big major tension, right? We're talking about people who were committed to nonviolence but still own guns. Malcolm, Ida B. Wells, your namesake, Malcolm X, and other prominent Black activists have been adamant about the use of armed self-defense in the struggle for justice. I know some pastors that were part of the Black Panther movement or when they were a lot younger, and they had to wrestle with what does it mean as a Christian African-American growing up in this age where they knew by simply walking down the street that at any moment someone can become violent towards them. And they had voices on one side saying, take the nonviolent approach, and then the other side saying, you got to protect yourself and your family. So how do you navigate this, especially when faced with violent oppression? Because we are in a nation where white supremacist violence has touched our churches and our communities, and white supremacist ideologies have done so. Is it hopeful can you maintain hope while still purchasing, owning, having, using guns? Or are Malcolm and Ida wrong? Or is there some other way we need to be thinking about this?
Well, Ansley set up a sermon for me, using the language of logic and the language of kingdom, because those are the two primary sets of language that I use to describe the situation. So, but I'll do the history thing first, because that's where we're. That's one of the reasons we're here. So my research is on lynching, and specifically how Black Christians, how the categories that Black Christians use to resist it, because I deeply believe that lynching is the most violent, the most public, brutal, and violent instantiation of white supremacy in American history. So it's to me a perfect case study to think through. Okay, what creativity does this essentially force upon Black communities? Because in the face of that, when I came into contact with literature that suggested that Black communities were just kind of cowed into fear, I just didn't believe it. I don't think that's the way that human communities work. And so in understanding that especially in the late 19th and early 20th century, the most significant Black institutions were churches. I looked there for these sites of resistance. And one of the most interesting sets of stories that I paid attention to was Francis Grimke's ministry, especially the shift that he makes from 1899 to 1906, where in 1899, after the lynching of Sam Hose, he preaches this set of sermons on lynching, where he's like, what the nation needs is education, this kind of social, moral, theological education. If people understand that we're all created in the image of God, like all of these are things that are going to cut away at this violence. And then 7 years later, when the Atlanta race riot takes place, he's like, he basically says, he's like, I have weighed this. The only way that this stops is if the Negro defends himself. And what I saw in him is something that I saw also in others, that over time, if you don't begin in a position of affirming self-defense, it, like, over time, being faced with this violence over and over again will often wear away at that resolve. And that's something that, and this in a sense is also a callback to the way that Ansley started. This is not just a political conversation. Paul tells us in Ephesians 6 that we're up against powers and principalities. Specifically in looking at racial violence, and there are a number of, we're talking about gun violence. This violence as a category, there's a lot of interplay. But it takes different forms, even if we deal with it in one. So when we address gun violence, people are going to find other ways to kill each other. Our resistance is to that entire milieu, and what that's going to require is a different logic, and and a commitment to a different kind of kingdom, a commitment to a future, as we're told in Isaiah 60 and elsewhere, one where violence is no more. But part of what I think the call for the Christian is to live knowing that future is coming, and to live knowing that Christ has called us to live in that way now, which is to say the kingdom has come and is coming. But insofar as the kingdom has come, Christ has called the people who are committed to him to live in that way. So all that, like, we all have deep kind of inconsistencies that we're going to continually live with for the rest of our lives. But I do want to try to call us to think more deeply about those inconsistencies, and to attempt to be as consistent as we possibly can. This is a challenge to me too, especially. I mean, it is really, really hard to be nonviolent in a deeply violent world. But I think that creativity can not only yield dividends, but people will only know that there is an alternative if we show them. And that's I think one of the primary calls of the Christians, to bear witness to a world that we don't see, but one that we know is coming because of Christ's death and resurrection. So you set up that sermon. That's just there we go.
You can Venmo or Cash App her $5 later. All right. So Melissa, I'm curious how, factoring all these things in, let's get on the ground. And you're kind of like a historian sociologist in a lot of ways. You're looking at the world and making sense of it, and that's a lot of your scholarship has helped with that as well. How have attitudes about gun violence, and in turn gun control and gun ownership, varied among different groups of people? How have diverse communities drawn on their different backgrounds and experiences, for example, their religious commitments, their experiences with racism, their pre-migration experiences in other countries when participating or opposing movements to address gun violence? Because now we're talking about how do we engage communities with this, and different communities come with different priorities, perspectives, and values. I'm wondering if you can address any or all of that.
Yes, a lot to say. And I will say I am now in an American Studies department, so I'm freed up to talk about the present, not just in a history department. And also, at the end of the day, I'm a community organizer. What people are doing on the ground, that's what matters most to me. So I'll engage in this question and build off what the other panelists have said by calling attention to the specific case of how Asian Americans are responding to this problem. We know that Asian Americans are very diverse. We're talking about a group of people that come from different countries, different languages, different religious communities. I think one thing that is important to know is, number one, by and large, Asian Americans are generally supportive of gun control. Number two, Asian Americans have experienced a lot of racialized violence in the past few years due to both COVID and anti-China sentiment. That is a big part of my research, anti-Asian racism during COVID. What's been alarming to me is to see how Asian Americans, in relation to really big events like the shooting in Atlanta in 2021, and 1 month later, the shooting in Indianapolis, were both terrible instances of violence, often framed as racialized misogyny, often framed as anti-Asian racism, not as much framed as instances of gun violence, but they were. They were instances of spectacular gun violence. And I did an analysis of all of the Christian denomination statements on anti-Asian racism during COVID, and relatively few talked about Atlanta, as an instance of gun violence. I think it was the Church of God in Christ, which is a historically Black Protestant denomination, that actually said, oh, we're concerned about this issue too, because it's an issue of gun violence. So I think it's really a matter of how do we frame these acts of violence? Are we framing them as a problem of racism? It's that, but it's also a problem of the proliferation of guns in our country. One thing that has been very alarming to me is to see the research that shows that Asian Americans are responding to racism and violence with arming themselves and acquiring more guns and doing dangerous things with those guns. So I will drop in the chat just one study that is done by my Michigan colleague, Tzu-Yin Wu. I don't know if everyone can see it, but I will post it. She found that almost half of the people she studied, Asian Americans who got guns because they were fearful of attacks, are storing them unlocked, often unloaded. I mean, these are terrible things. These are things that people are doing that are very, very dangerous. So not only are Asian Americans increasingly buying guns, walking around with them, they're also doing things that endanger their own families. So I think that these are things we need to pay attention to. I'm very happy to hear that Tzu-Yin won a big NIH grant to study this in the next few years. We need to invest in research that considers how gun violence is engaged in by specific communities. So I'm going to end on a hopeful note on the subject of research. I'm part of this research group that got a loose grant to study how different Asian American religious communities do religiously inspired coalitional justice work. And one of the projects we are funding is a project here in Indianapolis. I put information about this in the chat also. A group is working on addressing gun violence, specifically with the Chin community on the south side of Indianapolis. And one of the things they're talking about is bringing Chin communities in conversation with Black communities in other parts of the city that have been mobilizing their religious communities to address gun violence for years. So we hope to see some idea sharing, some very locally specific responses to this problem. I think we should pay attention to lots of different things. History, we should pay attention to how people are making sense of big events, but we should really pay attention to the creativity that is being shown on the ground in local and hyper-local settings for people to try to address this problem, which is so multifaceted, as we've discussed for the past hour or so.
Thanks for sharing that. I mean, I know even for us at the Asian American Christian Collaborative, we didn't frame the Atlanta shootings, even though we call them shootings, as primarily a gun violence issue. And then as we kept doing the work of engaging with different communities, especially after Laguna Woods, where there was a gunman that went to a retirement service or celebration service of a pastor, and then basically pulled out a gun and started shooting at Irvine Taiwanese Presbyterian Church, that we realized, the things that are connecting some of the most kind of devastating mass incidents are guns. And so that was a pretty kind of gradual evolution for us. And so like a lot of the work that we've been doing since has been to address gun violence, both at the local levels as well as the national and federal level, which is why I'm sitting at the White House right now, talking to people from COGIC and some other, the PCUSA is here and a few other denominations, as well as with, it's a multi kind of faith effort as well. So talking about protecting houses of worship, with whether they're Jewish synagogues or mosques or whatnot, temples and beyond. And so, we find ourselves in a place where there is a different exercise of hope that we're called to enact through our lives to show people a better way. And that we are not called to act as if we are without hope, as the scriptures say, but to know that we have a God who is making and renewing all things so that they can make all things new. We have a couple of questions that are in chat. I'm wondering if we can kind of take a couple of minutes to answer them quickly, and then we'll wrap up our time together. The first is there an incommensurable tension between logic and kingdom values? And then can the panel address arguments made by Tolstoy, Will, Richard Gregg, among others, that nonviolence is more practical, dynamic. In other words, is there a historical truth to the idea that if we live by the sword, we die by it? Who would like to tackle that?
Sure. So one is, I mean, yeah, I think it's true. If we live by the sword, we die by it. I think, and, but I also, and this goes back to repeat something that Ansley said. There are some people who will make the argument, you know, take the nonviolent route because it works. Yeah, I mean, sometimes violence works faster though. And to just, in all honesty, the reason specifically to go the nonviolent route is fundamentally a moral one. It is so to go back to the kind of logic and kingdom values thing. What I'm referring to when I use that language, Spanish theologian Antonio Gonzalez, in his book God's Reign and the End of Empires, contrasts the logic of the kingdom of God and the logic of empire. The logic of empire is the logic of violence, the logic of kind of might makes right, that kind of thing. And when you look at specifically Christ's ministry and the people that he gathers, it operates by a fundamentally different logic. That then it is out of that logic that what we call kind of the values of the kingdom of God flow. And one of those fundamental things is love of enemy, particularly. It's one of the things that sets, I think it's one of the things that in some ways sets the Christian faith apart. And that is most clear, particularly in the cross. And so as the people of God, if we're called to walk the way of the cross, one of the things that's going to require is in some ways an exposure to death. And this isn't non-resistance. This is just non-violent resistance. But, and this is the last point I'll make here. We're told in the scriptures in just a few cases, like very specific things that Jesus does by means of the cross. And we're told in Hebrews that one of the things that he does is he goes to the cross specifically to save those who are enslaved to the fear of death. To save those who are enslaved to the fear of death. And one of the things that I think continues to dictate our political decisions, our practical decisions, all of these things, is specifically our continuing slavery to the fear of death. And we are told by the scriptures explicitly that this is what Jesus came to save us from. So I think we have a responsibility to build communities that recognize that fact and act in light of that truth, that we actually have been saved from our slavery to the fear of death. What does that look like creatively as we love one another in our homes, your relationships with your children, your relationships with your coworkers, your relationships with your friends? What does it mean? What does it mean for that? What does it mean for that to bleed into all of those relationships?
That's good. And go ahead. Go ahead, Joey.
Yeah, I think I also wanted to respond with this question with a couple observations and some of the dilemmas that are there. There's the kingdom values, but then there's the other theological logic that Christians have used for aggression and for violence. And one of them is just war theory. And in American history, we have leveraged just war theory over and over again in order to complete and fulfill the social reformations that we want. The American Revolution, we depend upon the Boston Massacre to justify that act of aggression against us so that we could carry out war and get the liberties and rights that we deserve. When we talk about the North winning the war, the attack on Fort Sumter, so important because that's an act of aggression that gives the right for Abraham Lincoln to preserve the Union or to enact the aggressions that he needed to enact. And so finding ways to to elevate those kingdom values of nonviolence against competing theological values, I think that ends up being one of the challenges that we have to face.
That's good. I mean, and I hope that people are able to reflect on what both of you shared, because I think even and to your point, Malcolm, like I know that as we engage more through AACC on gun violence issues, that there is a greater fear because there's more scrutiny, there's more eyes on our efforts. I mean, I walk into rooms sometimes when I'm speaking and I'm doing a threat assessment. And and yet at the same time I'm like, well, for some reason the work that we're doing is gaining the type of traction that has even led to a statement that we put out landing on the desk of the president of the US. And so we're like, how do we navigate that tension? How do we not live in crippling fear but also engage with wisdom? And so thanks for sharing that. Ansley, it sounds like you have a thought.
Can I just add one thing quickly? And this sort of Melissa's beautiful examples made me think of this too, that there's like bodily danger in violence, but there's also internal danger. And so I love the examples that you brought out about like there's danger in owning these guns. So to your question in the chat, Ray, about talking with people in churches who think gun ownership is a God-given right, just talking to them with a lot of compassion about the potential harms in their own homes, in their own communities. And so I think like we need to have conversations about, protecting communities from violence, what that looks like. There's certainly some risks in pursuing nonviolence, but there's also risk in not doing it. And those are risks that could be accidental deaths. And then also what the logic of the world, what the presence of those violent guns does to the hearts. So one of the things that Black activists and people of color have had to do for a long time in this country is preserve their own sense of dignity, their own sense of safety in a violent society. And with people in church, to talk to them about like, what's that doing to you? What's that doing to your heart, to your soul, to own that thing? But there's a risk to you. And it might not be, you might think that you're lessening your bodily risk, you're not, but you are certainly posing a risk to your heart and your mind and your way of being in the world.
So good. There are other questions, but we're not going to be able to get to them because we've run out of time. But I did want to give a final word to a special guest, a friend. His name is Marcus Coleman. He's the director of the Department of Homeland Security Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. He's one of many of our friends with the Asian American Christian Collaborative. He's with FEMA. He just walked into the Secretary of War's suite to check on me to make sure that I wasn't hauled off of here. So he's actually going to give a word of encouragement to everyone who's chiming in, engage with the gun violence issue from the Christian perspective.
Absolutely. I want to thank you all again and thank the Asian American Christian Collaborative and Ray Chang. Thank you for being one of the prophetic voices in the room today. He may have shared that we were doing a conversation with the Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, the White House, and others, specifically thinking about protecting places of worship. But I am so grateful that we were able to help find him a room and a space to continue to be a part of the conversation as it relates to just preventing acts of violence and making sure that we're doing everything we can in partnership with the church and in partnership with the faith community to do violence prevention in every way possible. On behalf of Melissa Rogers, Executive Director of the White House Office of Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships, I want to also extend her thanks and just incredibly encouraged and inspired by what you all do. And again, he raised some very salient points in the room today, and we are looking forward to working with the Asian American Christian Collaborative and all of the partners that are on the call representing various seminaries and organizations to make sure that we do everything we can to make sure people can worship, fellowship, and serve in a safe and secure manner. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So with that, we will wrap. What a random and wonderful treat. Thank you all for taking the time to be here and allowing me to host as a guest. Always appreciate it. And again, if you have not read the Anxious Bench pieces, you need to read them. Joey, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you. Just to recap real briefly, we do have an upcoming event. We have another book talk coming on Thursday, October 12th at 12 p.m. Central Time with Mark Edwards about his book, Walter Lippmann, American Skeptic and American Pastor. I'm not going to rehearse the rest of the announcements just for the sake of time, but again, a massive thank you to Ray Chang for taking time to moderate this discussion, to be with us, to figure out how to configure all of it with his very busy schedule and with what's going on with him. And then, of course, to my colleagues at the Anxious Bench, so grateful that all of you were able to participate and be a part of this conversation today. Have a great day, everybody.